What you're about to listen to is an interview with Amy Rupertus Peacock, the granddaughter of General William Henry Rupertus, one of the longest-serving Marines of the United States Marine Corps. General Rupertus served during World War I, the Haitian occupation, commanded the China Marines during the Battle of Shanghai, commanded United States Marine Corps forces during the Guadalcanal Campaign, the Battle of Cape Gloucester, the Marianas and Peleliu Islands Campaign, and the Battle of Peleliu. Amy Rupertus is also the author of the brand new book, Old Breed General: How Marine Corps General William H. Rupertus Broke the Back of the Japanese in World War II from Guadalcanal to Peleliu, co-written with Don Brown. So please check it out at Stackpole Books and all other major booksellers. It'll also be released on Audible. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can even begin, I just need to remind you, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and much more, so go give them a look over on YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, and if after all that you are still hungry for some history content, why don't you go give my personal channel a look over at the Pacific War channel at YouTube. Over there, in particular, you'll be able to find video clips from this very interview that you're about to listen to, where it'll showcase exactly what the two interviewees were talking about and parts of their presentation. Check it out. You'll like it. Welcome everyone to the Pacific War podcast week by week in association with Kings and Generals, and this is going to be our first interview for the podcast. I am joined here by first Amy Rupertus. If you'd like to introduce yourself a bit.
Hi there, Craig. Thank you. My name is Amy Rupertus Peacock, and I am one of three granddaughters of Major General William H. Rupertus, who this Old Breed General book is about that we just wrote. And I live in Charlotte, North Carolina.
And we're also joined here by her co-author, Don Brown, former Navy JAG officer, and you've written now 15 amazing books. The last one I could see here was The Last Fighter Pilot. Please.
Well, thank you, Craig. Thanks for the work that you do and the Kings and Generals. Thanks for all the diligent work for keeping these stories alive. Amy and I are excited about this work on a grandfather, Old Breed General. I think it's going to open a lot of eyes and reveal a lot of historical facts that occurred during the Pacific Campaign. General Rupertus commanded the 1st Marine Division longer than any other general in the Pacific War, and was responsible for our first victory on the ground in the Pacific War, among other things. So we're excited about it. I'm very, very grateful that you're having us today, and hope that your listeners and your viewers, for those who are going to be seeing this on one of the channels, and for your listeners, enjoy our presentation and get something out of it. We really appreciate it.
And stating that, we can state what the subject matter is, your grandfather and your book that's now coming out. If you'd like to say a little bit about the book, perhaps, where they can find it.
Well, our book is available everywhere online.
And the book is entitled Old Breed General, by the way. I didn't mean to cut you in. Old Breed General.
Yeah,
give us the title there, Amy. Let's start there.
Right. Old Breed General. And it is available everywhere online. It's supposed to be released February 1, 2022. The Kindle version has already been released, though. So people are diving into that. We've been working on the story for a couple generations, but really hunkering down for the last 6 years to get the facts aligned with all that we have in our trunks. And, the photos, the diaries, the letters are just very revealing.
And also an audio version will be available as well. I don't know when that release date is. I think it's going to be contemporaneously with the hardback, but so there'll be Kindle audio and hardcover initially.
Excellent.
So you might, for people who do not know who our grandfather was, Major General William H. Rupertus, I can give you a little bit of background if I should jump ahead in that, Craig.
Absolutely. Please tell us.
Okay. Well, he served in the Marine Corps from 1913 to 1945. As Don said, he was the longest serving commanding general of the 1st Marine Division in the Pacific. Again, but he died in 1945, so his story has never been told until now. He is born in Washington, D.C. to a German-American family in the German-American community that was very active in the early part of the 1900s, late 1850s to early part of 1900s. And his parents were shop owners, and they were very involved with the German orphanage that was there and German church. And actually, a lot of the Rupertus family is buried in a section of Washington called Prospect Cemetery, Prospect Hill. And it's neat to go there and see those old graves. Our grandfather is buried at Arlington Cemetery, along with a lot of my family. So, but he is probably known for writing the Rifleman's Creed that Marines, he wrote that right after the Japanese bombed us at Pearl Harbor. And as an expert rifleman, he felt that the Marines, young Marines flooding the system, really needed to slow down and get to know their rifles better, because he knew the enemy, which we'll get into. He knew the Japanese enemy, and he also knew that these Marines were going to go to the Pacific, where, you know, we know about the Pacific was pretty rough conditions. So he wrote the Rifleman's Creed. He was the commanding assistant division commander, and then the commanding officer, division commander of the 1st Marine Division from Tulagi, well, really New River, North Carolina, when the 1st Marine Division really formed, and then through Tulagi, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. Well, you got Tulagi, Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and Peleliu. He's also, might be interesting to people who love the Pacific War history. He served in China and Peking in the late 1920s. And he went back to Shanghai in 1937, and he was there during the bombing of Shanghai when the Japanese attacked Shanghai. He was part of the 4th Marine Division, also known as the China Marines, protecting the American sector of the international settlements. And then finally, he was the namesake of USS Rupertus, which served our country from 1945 to 1973. It's a destroyer. And it was in some great battles. And we sold that ship to Greece, and they used the ship until about 1994.
I wasn't aware of that. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So his son is my father. His first family died in Peking of a scarlet fever epidemic, and his wife and 2 children all died. He was quarantined. When he eventually came back, a couple years later, he met my grandmother, Sleepy, who was much younger, and they had my dad in 1939. And my dad went on to, or our dad went on to be he graduated from Naval Academy in 1962 and then became a Marine officer. So that's a little bit about our family.
Fascinating stuff. And it really shows how interesting he was, as a character, because to have served in the China Marines before the Pacific War, it really made him unique compared to most of the United States, or even in Great Britain. A lot of the generals and admirals had no knowledge of the Japanese and greatly underestimated them. But your grandfather's someone who saw it firsthand.
Yes, and he so growing up back to Washington, he was a cadet at the McKinley Technical School. So that was high school, and then he joined the DC National Guard, worked in the naval gunnery. After he served there, he joined as an enlisted man and immediately got promoted to an officer, not immediately, but pretty soon after. And then he joined the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service Academy, which is the predecessor to the Coast Guard Academy. Mm-hmm. And he served there for 3 years, traveled the world on his summer tours, and basically graduated second in his class of 14, but on a medical, we discovered this. We didn't know this previously until this research journey, but he got a diagnosis of Bright's disease. So he's in his early 20s, and he was told, the naval or the revenue cutters doctor said, you're going to die in 5 years. We can't take you on. And, you know, it just was devastating. And so he resigned. And then a few weeks later, he joined the Marine Corps. He signed up to be an officer in the Marine Corps. I guess he decided he just would give his life to the country. And he served the Marine Corps for 35 years and, you know, obviously didn't die in 5 years. So, so back to that. So after he was in the Marine Corps, he served on the Rifleman's team. They immediately picked a couple officers up to compete on the Rifleman's team from about 1913 to 1915. So that you can see he's developing. He worked as naval gunnery. He's working at the Rifleman or on the rifle team. He's becoming this expert rifleman. Then he gets pulled away to go on the USS Florida, which was going to help our allies in Europe. And he spent some time on the USS Florida. And we've actually got a huge diary from that. It's very hard to read because I imagine he was on the ship, and I don't know if he couldn't write as evenly on the waves, but we do have a diary from that. It's not in the book, but because we dropped the reader in World War II. But so moving forward, he was on the USS Florida, and then they asked him to go to Haiti.
Yeah, I found that very surprising, that small side mission where he was involved in Haiti for 3 years, I think. Yeah,
well, what I've read, and they're different reports, but the Germans were in Haiti. I don't know if people know that, but they were, and that's pretty close to the U.S. So there was that threat of not only instability of the Haitian government, but the threat of the Germans being a little too close. And so he was there to help. He helped establish the Garde de Haiti, and also he was chief of the police there. And that was accompanied, so his wife and children were there. His first wife and children were in Haiti as well. So we've got letters from the Haitian president at the time, like hand-signed, and lots of photos from them too. Again, only a few are in the book, but you can see his career is building up all over, the world.
Yeah.
So next up, he has a few other duties back in the States, and then gets his first Far East assignment to go to Peking, China, to again guard the Peking legation, the American sector of the Peking legation. And it was a fairly calm time during 1929 to 1931 when he was there.
It's just after the Northern Expedition, so Chiang Kai-shek is kind of consolidating himself at this point. Yeah, I guess it's in Chinese terms, it's a little more stable than usual.
Right. And he spent some time with Roy Chapman Andrews. I don't know if you're familiar with that name, but he was an explorer of the Gobi Desert. And and he helped the Marines out. They, as a result of him being the explorer, they would leave gas all around China and the Gobi Desert, and so could map China pretty well. And so he and another officer, Pete Hill, did a lot of exploration. So Bill was friends with them, or my grandfather, General Rupertus, was friends with them, and did all sorts of exploring during this semi-calm time. But unfortunately, just months after they arrived, in 1929, his daughter, right before Christmas, his little daughter, Anne Rodney, was diagnosed with scarlet fever, and she died within 2 days. And then they came around to February, my grandfather was quarantined, and his wife, Marguerite, who was 38, and his son, Will Jr., who's 14, got scarlet fever, and they died within 24 hours of each other in February 1930. So, I could only imagine how he felt losing his family, and it was really hard for me to get through these chapters writing. But I found an interview of someone who was a surgeon during that time, and he talked about Rupertus and how he responded, and he was just devastated. And people didn't see him for about 2 weeks, and then he knew he's coming out of quarantine. He didn't, for whatever reason, scarlet fever didn't take him down, but it took his family down. His family was shipped back to Washington. They're buried at Arlington Cemetery. There are two, if you have his grave, and then there are two little graves for his children. Anyway, he stayed on, and he couldn't leave. They didn't have an officer to replace him at the time. The Marine Corps was pretty small back then. And I'm not sure, I mean, looking at now with COVID and everything, I'm not sure he could leave because they didn't want to transmit.
That's true, yeah.
But supposedly he lived right next to Holcomb at the time. And so Holcomb, who went on to be Commandant, General Holcomb, got to see how my grandfather, rallied. And I don't know what it would be like to go through losing your whole family, but somehow he managed to power on. And that's kind of the description of his whole life. He just somehow, powered on. So anyway, so he came back from Peking, and he again worked a desk duty for a little bit. And then the person on his way back from China, he had met Joe Hill on a naval hospital ship that took him back to the United States. And Joe Hill had a niece named Sleepy Hill, who thought Bill Rupertus, Major Rupertus, would be a good match for. So long story short, Sleepy and Bill got married in 1933 on the day that Roosevelt was inaugurated back in March 3rd, I think March 3rd or 4th, when they used to do the U.S. inauguration in March. So any questions so far?
None thus far. It's
Okay.
incredible that he was able to overcome the grief of losing his entire family in a foreign country, mind you, too. It's tragic.
Yeah, well, then right after, one thing I want to mention that I think is important for people to know if they don't know is that right after he came back, the Japanese bombed Taipei, the suburb of Shanghai, and killed, I guess, over 1,000 people. And to me, that's kind of the beginning of the beginning. He wasn't there during that time, but surely he heard about it. And by 1938, he was back in China. The Marine Corps sent him back to China because of the experience he had, I guess, in China before. And he brought Sleepy, which is kind of crazy after losing his first family in China. He brought his new wife. Well, they've been married for a while now, but, and from the pictures, it looks like they had quite a nice time with international settlement. Shanghai was very, a great place to be, very international, lots of people to meet. So they went out and had fun at the French Club and all the old places where people used to enjoy going out and having dinners and dancing. But then on August 17th, 1937, the Japanese bombed Shanghai, and everything changed overnight. Our grandfather, the Marines went on alert. Admiral Yarnell, Henry Yarnell, who was the naval officer in command there, sent out a notice that all wives and Marines that could leave needed to leave, evacuate immediately. And so my grandmother went to the Philippines, where her sister was with her Navy husband, and she was there while the Marines stayed behind. My grandfather in the Marines, he was CO of the 4th Marine Division then. And so they were protecting this 3.5-mile sector, the American sector of the international settlement. And it was very, very tense because they could see the Japanese, as the Marines were guarding the sector, they could see the Japanese doing what they were doing to the Chinese and the violence that was happening. but they couldn't do anything. They were told to hold fire.
To add a bit of gravity, a lot of my audience have heard a previous podcast. I did cover the Battle of Shanghai, but to just remind people, the Japanese were thrown into Shanghai, and there is, as you say, the international settlement of most of the great powers had their own foreign legations there. Chiang Kai-shek had a ingenious and tragic plan to put the cream of the crop of his military all into Shanghai all at once to try and make a show that China would stand against the Japanese. And this inevitably led to some of the most devastating bloodshed in the Second Sino-Japanese War. And there were parts of the international settlement, the British parts, where there was a creek, the Zhujiao Creek is just beside them. So they literally saw with their eyes the Japanese fighting at a place like the Sihang Warehouse. It's a famous movie right now, The 800, which covered this battle. It's very tragic, and I can only imagine the things that your grandfather saw. Must have been horrifying.
Yeah. So to clarify, in case the audience isn't aware, these international settlements were kind of like island enclaves where European businesses and Americans and Japanese did business with the Chinese, and every country brought in their different guards to guard the sector of that they managed. And so, yeah, our grandfather and the Marines witnessed some brutal, awful battles in Zhujiao Creek, people trying to escape and just being shot, and people being bayoneted, pregnant women being bayoneted. I just don't want to go. It was so evil. But I heard, I can't verify this, there's a China Marine friend of mine, Dirk Haig, who's an expert. He runs the China Marine website. He said that it was so stressful for some Marines that they committed suicide because they couldn't respond, and they would get shrapnel hit at them. They witnessed brutality they'd never seen before. Officers, Marine officers, Colonel Price wrote home to Marine headquarters that he'd never witnessed anything as bad or read about anything as bad. It was worse than the Huns, he said.
Yeah.
He said, if we don't take care of them here, they're going to come to our shores. Yeah. And then Admiral Yarnell wrote this whole, about a 4-page letter back to the headquarters in the United States and just said, we are facing something that is not going to stand down, and we need to be prepared. So this is 1937. And, the Japanese do come near our shores, at least in America, or Pearl Harbor in 1941, but this was already happening. And so it was a pretty intense time. Sleepy finally, and the woman finally came back, I think around December. The records are really spotty from when they came, but I have pictures of them walking around with a Japanese general, seeing the devastation of Shanghai. So, it's really something in history that, as I was researching this, I was so surprised that so few people knew about, whether it's the bombing of Shanghai or the rape of Nanking. It just was startling to me. And even some Marines I talked to didn't know about it. And I think it's fascinating history. It's sad history, but it's pretty fascinating. So anyway, all this leads up to our grandfather, who has had all this experience in Peking and Haiti and the Revenue Cutter School and the rifle team. And next thing you know, after they come back from China, from Shanghai, they finally come back in 1938. They have my dad in 1939. He's CO of the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. And then he goes out to San Diego, and he's in San Diego when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And he immediately gets promoted to the CO of that base. Colonel Ahurst gets promoted, who was his boss. That is when our grandfather wrote the Marine Corps, or my rifle, the creed of a United States Marine. Thousands of men were flooding the system to go fight the Japanese in the Pacific and gearing up for war. And like I said, earlier, our grandfather knew this enemy pretty closely. He had seen what they were capable of. And he knew these young Marines, I guess they were 17, 18, probably some were 16, were rip-roaring ready to go, but they needed to kind of slow down, pick up that rifle, and get to know it a little better, because he knew that it would not only save them, but also save their brother, or that they were fighting next to in the Pacific. When you're boots on the ground, you've got, your knife, you probably got a grenade, you've got a, rifle. And so he wrote this Rifleman's Creed, and I'd love to read it.
Of course.
Okay. So here it goes. My Rifle, the Creed of a United States Marine by General William H. Rupertus. This was first published in the March 14th, 1942 in the Marine Corps San Diego Chevron. And it reads like this. This is my rifle. There are many like it, but this one is mine. My rifle is my best friend. It is my life. I must master it as I must master my life. Without me, my rifle is useless. Without my rifle, I am useless. I must fire my rifle true. I must shoot straighter than my enemy who's trying to kill me. I must shoot him before he shoots me. I will. My rifle and I know that what counts in war is not the rounds we fire, the noise of our burst, nor the smoke we make. We know that it is the hits that count. We will hit. My rifle is human, even as I am human, because it is my life. Thus, I will learn it as a brother. I will learn its weaknesses, its strengths, its parts, its accessories, its sights, and its barrel. I will keep my rifle clean and ready, even as I am clean and ready. We will become part of each other. We will. Before God, I swear this creed. My rifle and I are the defenders of my country. We are the masters of our enemy. We are the saviors of my life. So be it until victory is America's and there is no enemy but peace.
Bravo.
So Marines recited that for years at boot camp. It's been in some movies, probably most notably.
Full Metal Jacket, of course.
Yeah, that scene is pretty.
Everyone knows it from there.
Yeah, pretty tough. But it's pretty powerful. And he really wanted it to be not something that he preached, but something that Marines felt so deeply that it just became part of them. So after that, he leaves San Diego and joins General Vandergrift in New River, North Carolina in March 1942. And they gear up. They're gearing these Marines to get ready to go to the Pacific. Vandergrift's echelon, they split forces because the transportation was so tough. We were battling two fronts, Europe and the Pacific. So General Vandergrift took, the division commander, took his echelon from New River to Norfolk. They left, went around the Panama Canal, stopped off in Panama to pick up some booze for the Marines, and went on their way. Meanwhile, our grandfather went across the country and the Marines via train to San Francisco, and they shipped out from there. So his echelon. And then they all arrived in New Zealand. And basically, they were told that they would be going to battle within 6 months. Once they got to New Zealand, they'd have 6 months to train, get comfortable in the Pacific. And the truth is, the Joint Chiefs said, "Oh no, we just found out the Japanese are building a base on Guadalcanal, and we need you to get there in August." So my grandfather's his echelon arrived in July, and within days he had to turn around, and some of the Marines didn't even get off the ship, his Marines, and they had to go to the operations area where they were going to begin training outside of Fiji Islands. So I went really fast, but I want to have time for Don to jump in, my excellent co-author, to really talk about what we were against. And I mean, we were losing, and Don's going to take it from here because we're coming back.
Well, I will try to, it's okay at this point, Craig, see if I can share this PowerPoint. Let me know if you're up. You with me?
Yeah, I can see it. And I'll just remind the audience, while this is an audio podcast for Kings and Generals, on my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, I will most likely formulate some clips or other videos to showcase a presentation that they are showing me. and you can check it out later. I think it'll be very exciting for you.
Okay.
Carry on.
All right. Let me sort of pick up from some of the great background Amy's given us. Her grandfather, General Rupertus, is one of the giants in U.S. military history. If there were a Mount Rushmore carved of World War II, and especially the Pacific War, his visage should be there. But because he died prematurely, we're just learning fully about him now. His background in China, particularly in the 2 stints with the China Marines, but especially in 1937 when he witnessed the massacre at Shanghai. And I know you've talked about it, Craig, but 200,000 or so, Chinese killed by the Japanese from August to November of 37, approximately. That's half the number of men that the United States lost in 4 years in the war. Rupertus witnessed this. So therefore, when he later came to be assigned along with General Vandergrift to build this 1st Marine Division at New River to go and to challenge the Japanese, he had a unique view of the Japanese, unlike most general officers. So he knew what they were facing. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, and for those who can see, there's a picture of the general there. We're showing a photograph now of General Rupertus on the bridge.
Share screen again. It seems to have disappeared.
Did we lose the screen?
Here, try resharing.
Oh, you got it, brother. Stand by just a second.
Oh, there we are.
We there?
Yeah, perfect.
We're showing a picture for those who can see of General Rupertus on board the USS Rupertus. That was the command ship under which the first operation on the ground was launched against the Japanese, which I'll go in just in a second.
The USS Neville.
Neville, excuse me. The Rupertus was later. So USS Neville, we're showing a few photographs on board the Neville. We're showing a photograph now of Amy's grandmother, Sleepy Rupertus, who she mentioned earlier, who married the general after he lost his first wife, Marguerite. Now we're showing a picture of his first 2 children, Will Jr. And Rodney, who lost their lives in China to the scarlet fever. And so these Marines in China knew something of what we're now experiencing with these coronaviruses long before, with something that's even more deadly. I want to talk a little bit about the situation, the military situation, though, in the spring of 1942. Of course, everybody knows, there's a lot of debate as to when World War II started. It depends on your perspective. In some ways, it may have started in the Pacific with the invasion of Manchuria. The Japanese, it just depends on what the historian you talk to. The Japanese have been very aggressive in China. Rupertus saw that. We were bombed at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and the Japanese literally went on a rampage around the Pacific. They went to Singapore. They went into the Philippines. You name it. The Japanese were basically putting a stronghold on the Western Pacific, really without opposition, and they pretty much had their way after December 7th. And the United States and the Allies were trying to rebuild and trying to get ourselves in position to challenge them. But really, until a couple of naval victories, first we had a kind of a draw at Coral Sea. Then there was a great naval victory at Midway in June of 1942, under which we took out 6 of their carriers in that miraculous operation, which was a major blow to the Japanese Navy, but not a lethal blow, as we'll see in a moment. Things have been pretty slim. But a bigger problem was, General Wainwright had surrendered some 70,000 troops, including Filipinos and some 20,000 American troops in the Philippines, the largest defeat in the history of the United States military. And so the Japanese had their way on the ground. And while the Navy had pushed back with those 2 marvelous operations, first at Guadalcanal and then even more so at Midway, we were reeling, and we needed a victory on the ground. And as Amy pointed out, there's a place called the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal is about 2,300 miles from Darwin, about 1,500 miles across the water or so from Brisbane, depending on where you're going in Australia. But the Japanese were using the Solomon Islands, hopefully for them, as kind of a staging base to move eventually into Australia. And at this place called Guadalcanal, they were building an airstrip, and we couldn't let them do that. So in August of 1942, August 6th and August 7th of 1942, the U.S. Naval Task Force with 70-some ships is carrying the 1st Marine Division approaching on a northerly course from New Zealand. Amy mentioned that. And there are going to be 2 task forces who are going to be hitting the Solomon Islands, hopefully by surprise through the dark. I'm going to talk a little bit about Guadalcanal because everybody's heard of Guadalcanal, but I'm going to talk about another place right across something called the Iron Bottom Channel, or it used to be called a Sea Lark Channel from Guadalcanal, a little place called Tulagi. Guadalcanal Island, for those of your viewers who can't see, is a big island which sort of has the shape of the state of California. If you turn it sideways, it almost looks like California. And across this Sea Lark Channel from Guadalcanal, 20-some miles, there's Florida Island, which looks a little bit like the British Isles. You know, not exactly, but both turn on their side. Just off of Florida Island, there's a small island called Tulagi. And Tulagi Island was the capital, the British capital of what was in the British Solomon Islands. And the Japanese had come in and run the British off several months before and had taken control of Tulagi. And Tulagi, in a small island off of Tulagi, Gavatu, is where the Japanese had their seaplanes, where their air power was located for controlling that section of the Solomon Islands at the time. In the meantime, they were building a large airstrip on Guadalcanal. But what had to happen before, we could actually move into Guadalcanal and try to secure that? We had to secure and take and defeat the Japanese forces on Tulagi. Okay, if any of your viewers or listeners have seen the HBO series The Pacific, if you've seen that, what happens at Guadalcanal initially is a fairly accurate representation because our Marines went into Guadalcanal largely initially the first few days without much opposition. The Japanese began to counterattack. But Tulagi had to be taken before we could even do that. And so General Rupertus, working with General Vandergrift, Rupertus was given the responsibility of taking his Marines and their task force into Tulagi to attack it, to defeat it, and to secure it before we could even move on to Guadalcanal. Because the last thing we needed was the Japanese to be able to hit us by the air with their seaplanes located on Guadalcanal and Gavatu. Now, you're seeing here basically the direction of the naval task forces that came in. And the task force broke just southwest of an island called Savo, in which one task force, which brought General Vandergrift's group in, sailed basically to the south, waiting to come on to Guadalcanal. The other task force, commanded by General Rupertus, moved in position to attack Tulagi, which those operations began on August 7, 1942. On the morning of August 7, 1942, again, we haven't gone into Guadalcanal yet until we first hit Tulagi. Rupertus is assigned the responsibility of hitting Tulagi and hitting Gavatu as well. He's given air power initially from 3 U.S. carriers, the Wasp, the Saratoga, and the Enterprise, who are positioned south of Guadalcanal and flying their missions over the top of Guadalcanal. Remember, Guadalcanal was not yet as organized a Japanese stronghold to hit Florida Island, to hit Tulagi Island, and to hit various other points in order to give us a little bit of a beachhead going in. What we're seeing now is a little bit of a closer look on the general area there between Guadalcanal and Tulagi. You can see the Sea Lark Channel is 20-some miles apart. Task Force Yoke was a task force, the Marine Task Force, and that part of the division, 2,500 or so Marines under the command of General Rupertus. In the meantime, General Vandergrift took his ships to wait off the coast of Guadalcanal for the operations against Tulagi. A little closer view here of Tulagi and the islets off of it, Gavatu and Tanambogo. They were connected by a little land bridge, literally several hundred yards off the southeastern coast of Tulagi. And if you look at Tulagi, the Japanese were concentrated in the southeastern portion of that island. That'll become significant in a second because Rupertus pulled a very daring maneuver in attacking Tulagi on that morning because we wanted to hit him by surprise if at all possible. What we're seeing here is a map of Tulagi Island. And if you'll notice in the far right-hand corner, the southeast quarter, most of the Japanese forces are there. Rupertus' daring maneuver here is that he sent his men into Beach Blue up along to the northwest of where the Japanese were located. It was a daring and unexpected amphibious invasion. By the way, this is our first amphibious invasion of the war. And so Rupertus, at least in the Pacific, so Rupertus goes in, and the reason it's daring is because that whole area off Beach Blue is full of coral reef. So you cannot even get landing craft initially up onto the beach because of the coral reef. So you have to stop several hundred yards, jump out of the landing craft, and then wade in. The Japanese are not expecting the attack here. They think an attack is coming, but they have fortified in the southeastern part. So the Rangers under Colonel Edson, under the general's command, hit into this area of Beach Blue and then begin moving down to the southeast quadrant of the island, coming in to hit the Japanese from behind and surprise them. They were able to pull that maneuver off. We're seeing some photographs, actual photographs now of the U.S. Marine Raiders coming on board on the morning of August 7th, 1942, there at Beach Blue on Tulagi. This is approximately almost 3 years to the date from Hiroshima and from the atomic attacks in Japan. So just to give us an idea of where we were. But again, we got to have a victory on the ground here. What we're seeing here are photographs taken from a U.S. Navy plane showing the direction under which Edison's raiders are moving to the south east to attack the Japanese enclave. They got to cross this big ravine, and they do essentially come in from that behind and surprise the Japanese and hit them there. We're seeing here another map of the positioning between Tulagi, which was the first ground invasion that was launched by the first Marines, and the islands of Tanambogo and Gavatu, especially, where we have seaplanes as well. We see that it's at 08 in the morning when the Raiders hit Tulagi initially and begin to move their forces to the southeast, and then the 1st Marine Paratroop Battalion, which was activated at the time, hits Gavatu at about noon, and they both run into very, very fierce resistance. So again, unlike what we saw accurately in the Pacific series, when Vandergrist's Marines go initially onto Guadalcanal without resistance, Rupertus's Marines here are going into the teeth of resistance. We're showing some photographs again from U.S. Navy photographs of the cricket grounds burning. As our Marines are moving again to the southeast, trying to put a stranglehold on the Japanese forces there. It's a photograph of Tulagi Island. We're showing now a map of Gavatu and Tanambogo. These were considered islets. They rise up out of the Pacific, and they're connected by this dam or this land bridge, as you can see. And so at about noon, the 1st Paratroop Battalion hits there, again under heavy fire. This battle on Gavatu will go on from the 7th into the 9th before we finally get it secure. Photographs here of Gavatu and Tanambogo burning as we have to rout the Japanese out there. What we're seeing now is a kind of a map of where the troop ships were located. The Neville was the flagship that General Rupertus was on, and we see several other ships here, the President Jackson, the Hayward, and others. And so they would run in to Beach Blue from these positions off the shore, bringing our Marines in as they would hit the ground. Here's another map of Tulagi and Gavatu, so you can sort of see them together, and again showing the 1st Marines coming in, the 1st Raider Regiment coming in at 8 a.m. on the 7th, and then 4 hours later the operations commenced on Gavatu. I mentioned earlier Savo Island. Savo Island, as it turns out, is the 2nd largest naval disaster in history after Pearl Harbor for the United States. And so what had happened, as I mentioned earlier, our U.S. Navy scored perhaps the most magnificent victory in the history of the U.S. Navy. It's almost like our Trafalgar in some ways at Midway, when those 6 carriers were sunk through a combination of timing and weather and all that sort of thing. But even though we really weakened the Japanese Navy, their cruisers and their destroyers and their heavy attack weapons were still available, and they were going to be coming in here through this nightly Pineapple Express coming down the sleeve, which I'll talk about in a second. And they basically hit our several of our ships in a surprise attack on the night of August 9th and sent them all to the bottom. And it turned out to a naval disaster. We lost over 1,000 men. The numbers are actually in the book. But because of this, the Navy made a decision to pull those carriers out. We didn't want to run the risk of that. And so the Marines were basically left without a lot of protection for a while. There's another map here of what happened at Savo Island with these ships. Astoria, the Quincy, the Vincennes, all those went down. A number of the ships showing went down, and these were the cruisers and destroyers that were out there to the northwest that were supposed to be guarding the approach and protecting the Marines as they came in first to Tulagi and then to Guadalcanal. This turned out to be a naval disaster. Somehow we got through it. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, let me jump in there. So during this time, General Vandergrift was alerted back on Guadalcanal that the Navy were getting tense and they wanted to pull out earlier than they had planned to. And the Navy had all the supplies for the Marines, the food, the ammunition, all the stuff that they were going to unload and use on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. So Vandergrift left Guadalcanal in the evening to, if you were looking at a map, you'd see Guadalcanal and then Tulagi and the Florida Island, there's about 20 miles distance. So he's going from Guadalcanal to go find General Rupertus to tell them the Navy's pulling out, you need to unload whatever you can. Well, Vandergrift kind of gets a little lost, and he eventually gets to find Rupertus, and Rupertus was on the beach, and so he went out and they met on the USS Naval, and Vandergrift said, the Navy's pulling out, you need to alert your Marines to unload as much as you can as possible. And while Vandergrift was coming over, they witnessed, before he even saw Rupertus, the Battle of Savo Island had started. And so it was obviously a very tense time. But Rupertus, came right back, and they unloaded as much as the supplies they could. And then the Navy did leave. And I don't know if in the Pacific it really is, it was really scary for the Marines, because here they are in the Pacific without enough food, without enough water. And my Aunt Jo, whose husband was also in the Pacific, always used to say, oh, those poor Marines were all alone. And I never knew what she meant until I actually studied this and learned from different diaries of what happened. And I think in the book, we've done a great job to honor the ships that went down and the lives that were lost. I mean, it was really just devastating. But the Marines survived, as they tend to do. And the Japanese had left when the Marines landed on Guadalcanal. The Japanese had taken off and left food on the table. They, went more inland, and they left food on the table. They left communication equipment. So the Marines on Guadalcanal had some benefits over there, but it was a really hairy time.
Yeah, and there were actually Battle of Savo Island Part 1 and Part 2. And what Amy mentioned, if you're looking at this map, Vandergrift was now off of Lunga Point, and the ships were there. His transport group was larger than, you can see there were twice as many ships on the Guadalcanal transport group. And so he goes in a boat across this, Sea Lark Channel. They're looking for General Rupertus, who is on board USS Haywood. They finally find him, but they're seeing these explosions off to the west, and these explosions are the first attack on these cruisers, and several of the cruisers going down. They can see, off to the side. It's certainly a terrifying thing. The Japanese did come back, and by that time, Admiral Scott had taken command of the U.S. naval forces and executed a strategy to block and to intercept the Japanese and turn them back. But even after that, when you look at the movie The Pacific, you see, when we see the story of the great John Basilone and the Americans, the Marines are being hit almost every night from these ships coming down the sleeve from Noumea and from New Britain, as we'll see in a moment. But it was a very, very hairy time. It's a photograph of General Rupertus with his staff at Tulagi, and General Rupertus is on the middle row there, sitting kind of by himself, and it's a very excellent photograph that was taken. Say again, Amy, want to add something?
It's a pretty famous photo, but yeah, according to our grandfather's diary, I mean, there was constant threat from the air, from the sea. It was code red, green, red, green, and this was going on for weeks at a time. So
keep going all the time.
That's a pretty famous picture in the Marine world and some World War II history Pacific of the officers who took Tulagi and men. So.
Right. We have a couple of headlines there. The Sunday Star in Washington, D.C. announces Navy, launches an offensive against the Solomons. We did not know where. It was all sort of speculative. We didn't know it was Guadalcanal or somewhere else, but they did a pretty good job of getting the story kind of right. What I'm showing here is Lunga Point. I know you're very familiar with all this, Craig, where the 1st Marines were setting up and trying to establish a perimeter around the airfield the Japanese had started to build, because that was really the big grand prize of Guadalcanal. This is depicting the situation on August 12th. Now remember, August 7th was D-Day at Tulagi. By the 9th, we'd scored our first victory on the ground. General Rupertus and his Marines had taken Tulagi, which fell the 8th, and then the next day, the following day, Guapatu and Tamambogo fell. But we had a lot of work to do now that we secured those 2 places to get moving on Guadalcanal. What we're seeing here is the Solomon Islands, and you can see this is a more modern map, but we see where Guadalcanal is located. And the Japanese were coming down the sleeve, kind of like the middle of this whole section of islands. I'm going to pull away for a little larger map here. They were coming out of Rabaul, which is on the island of New Britain, and General Rupertus would later become involved in fighting there in New Britain. Well, I'll talk about that in a second. But where this red map is located is basically the route that the Japanese Navy would come down almost nightly to hit Marines in the Solomon Islands, especially on Guadalcanal. We're seeing here again the juxtapositions of Savo, Tulagi, Florida Island, and Guadalcanal, the entire area that had to be controlled. And interestingly, General Vandegrift, General Rupertus, we see here would go back and forth between Tulagi and Guadalcanal across this Sea Lark Channel, which later became known as Iron Bottom Sound, on one of these Navy yard patrol boats. I mean, it was a dangerous thing just to cross that place. And this is taken on the Tulagi side. Is that right, Amy? Your grandfather?
Yeah, and he's jumping out of, I believe that's an old tuna boat.
Right.
Yeah, he really liked those, and those he really thought that the YP boats, he really appreciated the work, and he always would look at when they would go from these boats. They were former tuna boats that would go from Tulagi to Guadalcanal, bringing Marines, supplies back and forth, and they really put themselves at great risk.
They did.
So he's jumping out of one.
Well, you're taking your life in your hands every time you're crossing that Sea Lark Channel, because the naval danger the Japanese continue to bring in. They're still continuing to load troops onto Guadalcanal as they're doing this as well. And here we see Savo Island becomes known as Iron Bottom Sound. That really traced back to the first Battle of Savo Island, when we lost so many ships there. And again, this is showing the defensive perimeter that we kind of built with our Marines around that Lunga Point area, as the Japanese continued to sort of build up really on both perimeters on the east and the west. Again, another photo showing after the Battle of Edson Ridge, which I contend is the second major battle on Guadalcanal. There were a number of skirmishes, but 3 big battles, of which General Rupertus commanded the final one. And I'll talk about that in a second. The Battle of Tenaru, some call it Alligator Creek, Battle of Edson's Ridge, and then the Battle of Henderson Field, with the final battle, which we'll talk about in a second, on Guadalcanal. We're showing some pictures here snapped off of Alligator Creek, or the Battle of Tenaru. The Japanese attempted a major offensive, again, to come into the perimeter and to break the perimeter that the Marines had set around Lunga Point. This is a map showing the battle for Henderson Field. And of course, you know that better than me, Craig, but they try to basically a battering ram type of maneuver to try to push up into the weak side of the Marines' defensive perimeter. And this is when John Basilone basically showed his great heroics. But here's the rest of the story that a lot of folks don't know, and we do supplement and correct the historical record. General Vandegrift had left Guadalcanal and had gone to New Caledonia for meetings with Admiral King. He left General Rupertus in command during the final battle from the 24th to the 26th. And Rupertus actually wound up commanding the final battle and the largest battle there at Guadalcanal. There were other skirmishes afterwards, but this basically, I would contend, broke the backs of the Japanese as a force to be contended with on the ground. You're seeing a photo.
John, let me jump in there real quick.
Yes, ma'am.
So the Commandant Holcomb had come to Guadalcanal to get Vandergrift and go up to meet Admiral Halsey and Numia to advocate for the Marines because they did need more equipment. And it was during this time, in my grandfather's diary, again, General Rupertus, he's over on Tulagi, and he was going back and forth, but General Vandergrift called him over, and in his diary, he says, "I'm to command in Arthur's absence."
Right.
So
Vandergrift called him back across the Sound to take command while he was out of town. And it just so happened the Japanese started their offensive during that time period. And Vandergrift flew back in, I believe, on the 26th, the final day of the battle, if I'm not mistaken. But it's kind of an unknown part of history as to how that came down. So we're taking care of that. It's a photograph of Admiral Nimitz awarding the General Navy Cross, August 1st, 1942, for his command at Tulagi. Now, here's an interesting story. The 1st Marines went to Australia for respite and to recover and to basically to battle, the dengue fever and malaria. A lot of them had, more than half the division had malaria. Well, during that time, General Rupertus was assigned to be the escort officer for a period of time for Eleanor Roosevelt, who came to Australia representing the Red Cross. And when Eleanor Roosevelt came to Australia, it drove all the American and Allied commanders bananas because, one, you got to impress the First Lady of the United States, and then two, you got security issues. But the general was also not just a fierce warrior, but a diplomat. And here we see a picture of the First Lady and the general in Australia. After the visit, and I think Amy has documented this very well, First Lady wrote the general a letter, a handwritten letter thanking him for escorting him. And we have that and discussed that in the book. And this is a letter from the 1st Army Corps, September 16th, 1943, Brigadier General Byers writing on behalf of Admiral Nimitz, General MacArthur, thanking General Rupertus for so well serving the First Lady. I want to talk about a little bit the movement of the Pacific War after the Marines were done at Australia. In Australia, Vandergrift was called away, and now at this point, Rupertus is named as the sole commander of the 1st Marine Division. And so, as you know, Craig, the American forces were involved in this island hopping campaign, eventually to strangulate Japan and maybe even to invade. And the 1st Marines had fought so valiantly that this is sort of unknown as well, but there was a political tug of war going on between Nimitz and MacArthur over who was going to command it. Yeah.
I want to hear this.
So never has been a personality maybe in the U.S. military like Douglas MacArthur. But at any rate, MacArthur wanted the Marines under his command. And Roosevelt had a unique way of arbitrating these things. And so MacArthur got his wish. And so the Marines were initially transferred to General MacArthur's command in New Britain. Here we have New Britain. And remember a moment ago, we showed that map of Noumea, which is at the northeastern corner of New Britain, which is where the Japanese Navy had consolidated. Admiral Yamamoto had gone there. He was later shot down by the U.S. Army Air Force flying a reconnaissance mission from there. But MacArthur wanted to continue strangling and tightening the Japanese. So, we'd gone into Bougainville and we'd taken those islands. MacArthur wanted to put a stranglehold around them by moving into New Britain on the other side. So Cape Gloucester is located at the opposite end of New Britain from Noumea. So it was, you'll appreciate this as a Canadian. I suppose you're Canadian, Craig, you're in Montreal, but I don't want to assume anything, but you Canadians and your British brothers and sisters appreciate Boxing Day, and so do I. So it was Boxing Day 1943 that the 1st Marine Division under General Rupertus commences operations against Cape Gloucester. Here's a better map of New Britain. You can see it's off of the New Guinea coast, and you can see Rabaul, where the Japanese were located. So military operations were started that day under some very rough waters, and this is a remarkable photograph of the landing on New Britain. As you can see, U.S. Marines storming through very rough waters. A photograph here of General Rupertus raising the American flag once they had established a beachhead. New Britain is one of those things, you know, when you see, if you've seen the Pacific, they call it a green monster. So I mean, the rain, the monsoons, and the rainy season were almost as much of a challenge, like they were sometimes in Guadalcanal, as were the Japanese. But some remarkable photographs of New Britain. And for
can you back up to that, John?
Sure, go right ahead. You want last photo, Amy? You say? Yeah. Okay, go right ahead.
So here they had just captured the airport, and they're actually praying for the lives that were lost. So for the listeners who were looking at it, it's a pretty famous picture of on Cape Gloucester. There's a plane. I don't know if that's a Japanese plane, Zero, but it's on the ground, blown up. But the Marines are all, their heads are bowed underneath the American flag, and they're actually praying. There's a chaplain there, and for the lives that were lost, taking Cape Gloucester and getting the airport. So it's pretty powerful.
Just some remarkable photography. This map is showing where the Marines came in. They came in on two beaches, and the Japanese, of course, were entrenched. And so they got into a firefight there from Suicide Creek to Hill 660, which is where the Japanese were entrenched. And it was literally like a jungle-infested hill that our Marines have to go up the side of, and it was just really rough going. When Cape Gloucester fell, the Marines received a congratulatory letter via radio from President Roosevelt, and this is a photograph of General Rupertus reading that letter to the troops. So the president, the entire U.S. military, and the Allies were very much aware of what was going on. A little closer view of that is a very moving photograph. After this is an interesting photo, because after New Britain, the Marines again needed rest, some rest and relaxation. Remember, after Solomon Islands or after Guadalcanal, they got to go to Australia. Everybody loves Australia, unless you're locked down with COVID there now. But everybody loves Australia. But in this case, it wasn't to be. So they go to a place called Pavuvu, which is a jungle-infested place and wasn't so great for the morale. But General Rupertus heard that Bob Hope was nearby at another island. What was the other island? Do you remember, Amy?
Danica.
Okay, and so the general sends for Bob Hope. Bob Hope comes over and entertains the troops on Pavuvu. And here's a shot that was taken of that with the general sitting beside Bob Hope, who was great. Probably a little before your time, Bob Hope, Craig, but I remember when Bob Hope was even in Vietnam, he was a great guy, always entertained the troops. It's an overall map of the sweep of, again, the island hopping campaign, because after New Britain, the next step was Peleliu. And Peleliu, of course, was a controversial strategic decision. There was a lot of, back and forth on whether to go there or not. General MacArthur, by this time, the 1st Marine Division has now been given back to Nimitz, okay? So MacArthur has lost control of it. However, MacArthur, sort of left the Philippines and, for him in disgrace, but he promised, I shall return. He was hoping to do that. If you look at where Peleliu is located, near Mindanao, it's several hundred miles off the southeastern Philippine coast. So MacArthur initially felt that securing Peleliu would give him a better chance of going into the Philippines, because the Japanese were heavily entrenched there.
Oh, if I can say something.
Go right ahead, brother. Yes, sir.
For the audience, because this, it's important for those who don't know, it is a very controversial battle, because MacArthur the entire time during the Pacific War was, like you said, fighting to go take back the Philippines.
Right.
So there was a divide argument at this point where they could bomb mainland islands of Japan because they had the Marianas. So they didn't really need to take the Philippines necessarily. They could go another route, but MacArthur eventually will win out the day. And he needed to neutralize Peleliu because I think argument was an airfield maybe could hinder operations against the Philippines. There you go.
And you're right, Craig. And just to add that a little bit, the U.S. Navy, Admirals King, Admirals Nimitz were pushing more toward an argument of, hitting Japan directly, as I recall. MacArthur wanted to, he wanted to have it, he wanted to have it his way. And Roosevelt initially, he took the 1st Marine Division back from MacArthur, but let him, so they did go into Peleliu. And the thing about Peleliu, it turned out to be one of the bloodiest, battles. And what had happened, a lot of people don't realize, is the Japanese essentially changed their battle tactics. We saw, again, if you go back, and I'm sure a number of your viewers and listeners, saw the docudrama of the Pacific, and I saw it, and partly I wanted to see it because we were working on this book at the time. I wanted to see how it was portrayed there. But, the General Vandegrift's 1st Marine Division weighed onto the shores of Guadalcanal, and the Japanese strategy has been kind of let them come in, and then we attack, okay? So you draw them in and attack. At Peleliu, they totally reverse that. And so they almost did that, from a microcosmos example back at Tulagi, and to a lesser extent, Gavatu, but there's no place for them to run and hide. Those places are so small. But at Peleliu, they, rather than dig in, they hit us very, very hard at the beaches and on the beaches. So it will become based upon that a more difficult struggle. The Army was involved. We brought the Army in eventually there, but you can see the strategic thinking was generally driven by General MacArthur, because initially he wanted his right flank protected as he moved into the Philippines. He did get his right flank protected at a rather high cost. But we have a few photographs from Peleliu. This is the General Rupertus and several overseeing a burial service there. I believe that's Chesty Puller right beside him. Is that correct,
yeah.
Amy?
So these are here a lot of the officers. And
yeah.
Peleliu is, one of the things I meant to jump in a couple of places, but our grandfather in the Marines had been in the Pacific for a while. And when they landed in Pavuvu, after they were finally released from MacArthur and could go get under Nimitz, went to Pavuvu. Rupertus had been trying, Vandegrift wanted Rupertus to get back in March 1944, but because of MacArthur wouldn't release him, he had to go right when the Marines landed in Pavuvu and were safe. They were at an island. It turned out not to be so good. Looked good from the outside, but it got better when the Seabees came. Pavuvu did. But anyway, our grandfather went back with his chief of staff, Colonel Selden. They advocated for the Marines in Washington, and basically the headquarters said some can come home, but we need trained officers to stay, and we need the men to stay. We don't have enough people.
And it goes back to the original point. Rupertus commanded this division longer than anyone. They needed relief. They probably needed relief before Peleliu, but weren't able to get it for logistical reasons and other reasons.
Peleliu is a fascinating, and as I was doing this research, I found the plan for the Japanese plan for building and staffing the whole underground tunnels and everything.
The limestone hill that they had, the old mining shaft, and it was really big.
I found it was from the U.S. Army's Demobilization Bureau, and they had translated these documents. And unfortunately, because word count, I couldn't put it in the whole book. We couldn't put it in the book, but it talks about the whole engineering plan for basically killing as many American Marines and our American military as possible. And between the connected tunnels and where they could hide out. We had been bombing them since March. Some people say that we only were bombing them bombing Peleliu for 3 days, but we had been bombing them since March. So you think we would have made some progress. And so I think there was a lot of belief that the naval bombing had. Well,
they thought that they had taken out most of the Japanese.
Yeah,
they had not even touched them, basically.
And in our intelligence, there was an intelligence failure for whatever reason. And I think it might be argued, and maybe you'll agree with this or not, Craig, but Peleliu was the beginning, basically, of a shift in the Japanese warfighting strategy on these islands. You see it replicated at Iwo Jima.
Okinawa was a big one after that.
Exactly. So this was the beginning of a new strategy we had not seen. In this photograph, General Rupertus is standing here. There are 4 crosses, and he is standing just above the 3rd cross to the right, and just to the right of the screen, to his left, is Chesty Puller, who of course was involved in the initial. Chesty was on the ground on D-Day at Peleliu, and that was really, really something. Some other photographs here, and Amy, feel free to jump in, taken on Peleliu.
So I think The best, I'm sure your listeners, or many of them, have read With the Old Breed by
Yeah, I would
Eugene
imagine.
Sledge. That is a great book on the boots on the ground and the horror they experienced throughout the Pacific, particularly Peleliu. The fact that they prevailed is just awe-inspiring, despite, you know, everything they went through. But here's a picture of my grandfather, our grandfather, checking in on the Marines. So that for the listeners who can't see this, there's this is Peleliu Island. There's a Jeep and there are a bunch of wounded Marines on it. Our grandfather's talking to them and on the beach and seeing how they're doing. You'll see in some pictures that he had injured himself. He was getting better here, but he had been getting in back in the training for Pavuvu, he had been getting into a boat and he grabbed a handle, a transport boat. He'd been going between islands and he grabbed a handle, and the canvas handle had disintegrated and split, and he fell down on some coral and he hurt his ankle. And so that's why it's wrapped with a picture of Bob Hope, and that's why he has a cane here. You know, it's a pretty powerful picture.
And he remained in command, I think, until November. This was a joint operation with the Army, as you know, Craig, and the Army came in and began to relieve the Marines after several weeks. And the general, say again, Amy?
Yeah, so the 1st Marine Division, the Army took over on October 20th. And most of the Marines went back to Pavuvu, their favorite place, but by then the Seabees had done a great job and it was much nicer. And our grandfather stayed there till November 4th, and then he flew back home to Washington with Geiger and about 3,500 Marines. So.
And from there was assigned command of the Marine Corps schools in Quantico. And Marine Corps schools, we were using Marine Corps schools basically, you know, to train officers for the Pacific War largely. So they had the right guy for the school. He took command of that. They were living in Quantico. And then, Amy, why don't you share how your grandfather passed away?
Yeah, so he he got back to Quantico, picked my Sleepy and my dad up from Washington, D.C. They lived in Quantico in officers' quarters, and he was coming out of the Marine Corps schools. He was given there was a big ceremony that we actually have on old film of him receiving receiving the Distinguished Service Medal from the Navy for Peleliu. And that was a big event there. He did a bunch of talks, PR for war bonds and that sort of thing. And he and Sleepy and my dad were going up to Washington to the Marine Barracks for a big party, a reunion of 1st Marine Division, old veterans of the 1st Marine Division, in March 1945. And at that party, he went outside and sat down and had a heart attack, and he died on the steps. And if you read the book, we talk about Colonel Kilmartin back in Guadalcanal. Well, he was really cared for Colonel Kilmartin, and he died on Colonel Kilmartin's steps.
Colonel Kilmartin had been the general's chief of staff during the initial invasion. And I have a picture here, and if Amy, right behind your head there, if you see what she has, the Navy very quickly honored the general by naming USS Rupertus a destroyer in his honor. And we're seeing a picture of Amy's grandmother at the shipyard in Massachusetts, christening that ship. And no higher honor does the Navy give than to name a ship after you. So,
Don, I just want to jump through. Craig, how are we doing on time? I can zip through these pretty quickly. Okay. So maybe, Don, is this?
You want to jump in with your PowerPoint and show a couple of things, Amy?
Yeah, let's try that.
Okay, stand by. I'm going to jump off here, Craig. I'm going to stop the share and let her, she's got a couple of things here. You ready?
Yeah. Okay, so really quickly, this was his, I'm just going to, so people are listening. I'm just showing quickly a picture of German-American family in Washington, pictures of Bill and the Revenue Cutters School, or Major General Rupertus is a young guy, cadet at the Revenue Cutters Schoul.
Which is the pre-runner of the Coast Guard Academy, by the way.
Right, and then here's a picture of him with the president of Haiti back in late 1919. And here are pictures of him and the Marine officers in Peking. There he is, and you saw that picture earlier with his 2 children. Again, they're buried with his first wife at Arlington Cemetery. Here's a picture. I said, it was kind of calm in Peking when he was there, and the Marines were told to play polo, particularly the Marine officers, to stay in shape. So here he is. Here's a picture. I mentioned Roy Chapman Andrews. He's right next to him with 2 other Marine officers. Here's a kind of picture of him again at the Peking racetrack. That was a real popular place for people to be. The Marines would march there, but also they'd play polo, which is kind of funny. Here's a picture of Sleepy and Bill Rupertus. And then here's actually this picture you look at, you can find it online on Google, but this is actually a picture that Don found online while he was researching his last book, The Last Fighter Pilot. Yeah. And he asked me if this was my grandfather in this picture. And indeed it was. And here they are at the French Club in Shanghai, dressed up in black tie, the Marine officers and some naval officers. It's the calm before the storm. I have some pictures in this this slideshow of after the bombing of Shanghai, and where the Marines are hunkered down, and also some pictures of the devastation, as well as more devastation and bodies. Anyway, so we've just going along that, we've got different other different maps. And one thing I wanted to bring up is the importance of the natives in the Pacific and the coast watchers. I'm sure many of you know about the coast watchers that were plantation owners and people that were used to watching, being near the coast, watching the coast. They really helped the Marines in the Pacific, especially our grandfather in Tulagi, and working with the natives. The natives were very supportive. We've actually got a letter from a native chief to our grandfather telling him he was working on rounding up different chiefs to help the Marines and that sort of thing. So we've got some pictures of that. One thing that maybe people don't know is Dr. Seuss was very involved with the effort. And so he sent a couple of Marines and other people the Society of Red Tape Cutters Award. And so we have a picture of that. You can Google those too. It's the Society of Red Tape Cutters. But is actually in collaboration with a newspaper editor, John Lewis. And then here's a picture of him in watching. There's a famous parade. 2 things happen in Australia that were really important. One, the Marines came in and it was like an invasion. And the Australian men were not there for the most part. So when the Australian men who had been fighting in Europe and Africa came back, all these U.S. Marines were there, and
it's a famous
dating
story.
their girls, and,
yeah,
and that sort of thing. So Rupertus and his officers thought of a plan to have a party, and they were going to have a party with the Australian men, the Australian military, and the Marines on the cricket field. And there was going to be beer, and they wanted them to have fellowship and camaraderie and play some games and get to know each other. And the only caveat was that the beer needed to be in paper cups.
Oh, I've heard of this. Yes. Yeah.
And so as it turned out, there were no fights. They got to be good friends. And there's, I think Australians tend to have a good memory of this time, mostly. And there was also a parade. So and here is a picture of my grandfather saluting the Marines as they went by in the Marine band in the parade in February 1943. So here's some pictures from Peleliu. These are from the Marine Corps. These are also in the book. And then here's a really interesting picture that is in the book, and it's our grandfather and the Marine officers. It's probably a snapshot right before they left Peleliu, and you can see he looks like he aged probably 100 years. Anyway, so here's a picture, gets back into Washington. There's my dad, and obviously my dad's real happy to have his dad home. He is getting the Distinguished Service Medal from the Navy, and you can see his Guadalcanal patch right there on his sleeve of his jacket. Here's a picture of there's an American flag that was used for the Marines on Cape Gloucester and Peleliu. When my grandfather died, March 1945, they raised this same flag on Okinawa, or after he died, in his honor. So here's a picture, and there's an article that we put in the book that talks about this photo of this Marine climbing up these rocks, trying to get the American flag on top of the hill. And then, of course, here's Sleepy again. And then here's a picture of the USS Rupertus, a beautiful destroyer. You can see that little USS Rupertus canvas label is right behind me here. So years later. So finally, to close this, I don't know, or close our presentation, we've got an on-air interview that he did when he came back. Our grandfather came back in November 1944 from the Pacific. Craig, do you want me to go ahead and play this, or?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
Okay. So it's about 3 minutes long. So y'all just hang in there and let me start this. Let's see. This should work. It's actually 2 minutes long, 2:45.
General, which do you consider the toughest of these operations?
I don't believe there's any measure of comparison. Each campaign was against the same fanatically determined enemy, and each had its own problems of weather, terrain, and distribution of enemy strength. All the campaigns against the Japanese have been hard, bitterly contested operations that have demanded the utmost of every man engaged in them. I know that every man in every branch of the military service fighting in the Pacific is willingly giving everything he has to achieve a common goal, the complete defeat of the Japanese enemy. If that aim is to be reached, the people back home, each related in blood to a fighting man, must contribute in the same measure. The war against the Japanese is a very personal war. Every bomb and every bullet sounds as though it is meant for you in person. Much of the fighting is at the closest quarters. You are the man that psyche-crazed warrior is charging at as he runs screaming toward your lines. You are the man that gleaming samurai sword is going to cut through if you don't strike first. That's just what we've been doing out there, striking first and striking hard.
Well, it seems to have been working pretty well, General. We've gone a long way in the Pacific in the last 2 years. Do you think we're close to our goal of complete defeat of the Japanese?
The hardest part of the war lies ahead of us. As we get closer to the Japanese homeland, the Japanese determination and fanaticism becomes even greater. Their military strength also increases as we get closer to its source. This is certainly no time to sit back and contemplate our past successes. Rather, we should consider the tremendous task that lies ahead and mentally resolve to match in willing personal contribution, inspired by a love of country, the fanatic devotion to the emperor that spurs the Japanese.
Well, Friday was the 169th anniversary of the founding of the United States Marine Corps, General. What do you think the 170th year holds for the Corps?
I think it will probably be one of the fightingest years in our fighting history. We Marines are naturally proud of our past achievements, and as a Marine, I can assure the people of the United States that every man in the Corps will be doing everything he can to sustain our record and justify the motto of the Marine Corps, Semper Fidelis, always faithful.
Thank you, General, and I'm sure that every Marine will.
All right. We had never heard his voice before until we found this and one other. So it was not exactly what we thought.
Yeah, it's a rare instance that you have surviving audio from that time. A general like that, yeah.
Well, there's some fascinating video too. The University of South Carolina Film Lab, so in the States, has a repository of Marine Corps film and film actually from American history and maybe European history that they're storing and keeping. So we've been able to find a lot of film that we've not seen before either through that.
Excellent. Is there anything else either of you wanted to say?
Well, I thank everybody who's listening. I know we've talked about a lot. I hope it hasn't been too overwhelming. We put years of battle into just a few hours. But I'd say if you have, the purpose of me writing this and asking Don to join me on this journey is to get this story down, not only for my family, but for history. I think when we take the time to do this, it contributes to the database of history and it fills in the holes that that people don't know about until they know. And this is pretty important history that there was a lack of knowledge about from China onward.
I can attest. I didn't know much of this story. It's not found anywhere.
Yeah.
And for your listeners and viewers, Craig, if you're a history lover, if you're a World War II aficionado, if you're a student of the Pacific, this is like opening up a brand new present under the Christmas tree, yep. Or like a box of chocolates that Forrest Gump would talk about that's never been opened before. And so I love to read history. I love to read about Gettysburg, about Guadalcanal, about Normandy. I love to read those stories over and over again, but this is brand new for the first time. And my guess is it will spur others, to write and even make film about this. But here's an opportunity to get into something that nobody has ever read before. So I would just encourage all your listeners and your readers and your viewers to read this book and let us know what you think, and hopefully it'll open up other opportunities for conversation.
Yeah, and we have we didn't talk about show notes, but we have a YouTube channel. I haven't really publicized it, but I put up some of these films we found for General Rupertus. Mm-hmm. And also I'd be happy to, if anybody's interested in how to write their veteran story, I can give you those notes. But to get the all the references we have, you've got to look.
Yeah.
So again, it's Old Breed General. It's available on everywhere online right now, but it'll be shipped probably February 1st.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Google Books, you name it.
Yeah.
It's all there.
Yeah. And you can see the reviews we've gotten so far. I think people are appreciating this history because they never knew about it before.
We've also been told that Barnes & Noble's taken a pretty good interest in the book, and we expect to see the book. In Barnes & Noble stores, of course, we don't know with the ever-present situation with the pandemic. Hopefully it becomes an endemic and continues to shrink, but we're hoping to have a presence there as well, so keep our fingers crossed. The prayers launched, we'll go from there.
Yeah, I assure you, everyone in my audience, I implore you to get the book. I am getting it this week, as I just finished writing something on my own now, so I can finally read something like this. And something I say to my audience a lot, history evolves. We learn new things, and it changes everything. I, for example, in this entire podcast series, always bring up 2 books that recently came out about Emperor Hirohito. And the narrative that he was supposedly powerless or at the whim of his warlord-like generals is not true. He was a participant, and he made a lot of the decisions that we see. So a book like you have written could change the course of different battles, of the history of the Pacific War as we know it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for doing what you do. I really love your channel and the Kings and Generals channel, and I love history. So onward.
And one other thing, and I'll stop. I know the General felt this way. Amy and I feel this way, but this book is written not only to honor the General, but those men who served under his command. Colonel Kilmartin, that Amy mentioned, and others. He loved his men. He was a Marine's Marine, and I know that he would want that to be the case as well. So, God bless the United States Marine Corps.
And all those who serve in the Pacific, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to share this story.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. So please, go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, and if after all that you are still hungry for some history content, why don't you give my personal channel a look over at the Pacific War channel at YouTube. Over on my channel, you will find a few video clips of this very interview where I will showcase everything and compare it to actual combat footage to give a real taste for what the events were like.